Hello, friends. Today's chapter of the day is Isaiah chapter 24. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a setup to Isaiah chapter 24 because it really helps us understand what's going on, what's happening in the book, what's happening in Isaiah's life as he's making these prophecies over a lot of people. So, first of all, remember the test for a prophet is that a prophet has to bat 1,000. In other words, every prophecy a prophet says has to come true. Now, some of the prophecies aren't going to come true for hundreds or thousands of years, so we aren't going to test those during the prophet's life. But the ones that he prophesies during his life, he can't be wrong about any of those. And what's happened until now in the book of Isaiah is he's made prophecies about Judah and he's made prophecies about the surrounding nations, and those prophecies are coming true during his life. Not all of them, because some of them are long term, but many of them are coming true. So Isaiah has gained the reputation of being a faithful prophet. People now know that the things he's saying are true. Now, this is scripture, so whether he had that reputation or not doesn't really matter, but it helps us understand how the book was received at the time he was prophesying. Now, as to the time he was prophesying, many of you remember David ruled over a unified kingdom of Israel. All 12 of the tribes of Israel were united under David. There was certainly some squabbling as he was coming into power, but they all united. They stayed united under Solomon, but after Solomon, the kingdom divided into two pieces, really as a result of David and Solomon's sins. Northern part is called the kingdom of Israel. Southern part is called the kingdom of Judah. Isaiah is a prophet in the kingdom of Judah. So he is prophesying to the people of Judah about their sins, their transgressions against the Lord, and God's justice and his wrath in light of those transgressions. That's where he starts. Then he expands his scope and says, now I'm talking to all the neighboring nations. You've also transgressed against the Lord. You've been enemies of my people, and you will suffer my wrath as well. Now in chapter 24, we're expanding the scope one more time, and now he's talking about God's judgment over all the earth. And by and large, he's talking about God's final judgment in Revelation, be it in the tribulation or in the final great white throne judgment where God judges everyone. And what do we learn about that judgment? We don't really learn logistics about that judgment. We learn character of God. We learn that God is just. And we learn that God is just because we see verses like verse 2, where it says, as with the people, so with the priest. As with the maid, so with her mistress. In other words, it doesn't matter if you have a position of authority. God's going to judge everyone according to their works, regardless of what their standing was in this world. And then most of the rest of this text is about the power and the sovereignty of God. It begins, behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate. And it just goes on and on, talking about God's judgment. Now, in the midst of God's judgment, though, we see something else. We see in the midst of the judgment, verse 14, they lift up their voices. They sing for joy. Over the majesty of the Lord, they shout from the west. And here's a really important thing in Isaiah, and I hope you've seen it as we go through Isaiah. We see this picture of God's wrath and this picture of God's justice being opened up against his enemies. But in the midst of that, we see God's mercy and we see his preservation of a people. You see him following through with his covenant that there would be a Messiah that comes out of the people of Israel. And that Messiah is going to redeem his people and allow his people to escape that judgment. And not just escape it, to be there cheering for that judgment when it happens. So that's a picture of what's happening in Isaiah. The scope is broadening. Now we're talking about God's judgment over all the earth. But this isn't just doom and gloom, because in the midst of that judgment, we see this scarlet thread that runs through Scripture. And that scarlet thread is talking about the mercy and the grace of God, all of which will materialize in the person of Jesus. So I hope you're enjoying reading through Isaiah. I am. All sorts of things to learn, and I hope this leads you into further reading of Scripture. God bless.